In the beginning they were coins. Some say it was the word, or light perhaps, but not me. All I had to watch over were a few tiny pieces of gold, something you can easily move, and if you want, you could just hide them in your pocket. There was a certain freedom attached to it. You just took them, and suddenly you could go anywhere in the world. But of course you had to have a few spare coins, contemporary coins, made out of some ordinary metal, or perhaps some paper notes, also very ordinary. Everybody wants them, but not because they are beautiful. I guess if you want, you can exchange these ordinary coins for something worth looking at, something unique, and perhaps even beautiful. I believe there was no shortage of these spare coins and notes in the beginning, or maybe even before that. But none of these things were my concern at that time, or now. I did not even exist before that time. I came to be with the coins, and in some way, I am defined by the coins. Lots of these coins have a woman's head on them. Some say it's a head of Athena, the ancient Greek goddess. Wise heads claim that she is as a protective, defending goddess. Among other things, she was supposed to oversee the physical buildings and structures that were protecting the Greek people. Nowadays, we build different kinds of structures to protect the coins, like the one for Athena, and other things, of course. At a certain level, you have to shape the space and create an environment for your belongings. And then, once again, you have to watch over these structures. That's what I do. I guard the coins. And it's a mutual thing. I feel very safe with her, as she does with me. At least I think so. But it's not as it used to be. I had her in my pocket, in my hands, moving her from place to place. It was very easy. But one has to be careful. For some people, this goes beyond that. There are several myths where Athena defends her virginity when she receives unwelcome male attention. This is why the temple dedicated to her is called the Parthenon, as the word means Temple of the Virgin in Greek. At some point, you can no longer have the coins in your hands. And the same goes for Athena. One has to put her behind a glass wall. That makes her unapproachable, and a little bit lacking in compassion. But all these deeds come with the job. If you protect something, you just watch and stand. You very rarely act, but if you do, one has to be decisive. And with that, there is no room for compassion. You can think what you want, but that's not my concern. Perhaps someday, when someone asks, I might respond. Say what I see. But that would be another story. Maybe if you listen closely, you might understand. Before we had a stable roof over our heads, our borders were very blurry. There wasn't a single architecture or power which could look after it all. Things were scattered all over the continent and were moving around a lot. There were also new acquisitions, and this number of new things was getting larger, mainly because the lines were getting clearer with time. I remember once moving a tile panel, presumably very old, and there was one thing which struck me above everything else. This large blue dome emphasized by red lines and highlighted by a band with a decoration of arabesque green, white, and again framed by a red line. Some people say that these tiles were part of the Ottoman mosques, expressing the wealth and power of its empire. Many religious and secular buildings were covered by these tiles with red lines. In a way, this architecture was framing these tiles, and vice versa. I remember that some time after I started to look after this piece, there were talks about some other red line, also on a blue background. But they say the scale was utterly different. It was going through blue seas, lands, and countries, and once again it was dividing the Ottoman Empire. But this time, this line was not a declaration of a powerful empire. It was on its brink of death. People came and were asking about black gold and its line. I guess when you lose your power and glory, when something or someone dies, some other people will come and divide your belongings, your collection, and they will make their own red lines. A new agreement will arise. So around that time, our collection had finally a place to be. A house in Paris. I had not only a collection to guard, but the whole architecture as well. I became an observer. I was just watching and standing, and my interventions were subtle and almost invisible. They were like a thin line, binding the collection together. And since that time, on top of that, another line appeared, heavily discussed, and some people describe it as golden, others as black. I remember a room full of different kinds of things, from different centuries, lands, and cultures, loosely connected to each other. At that time, there was no problem to use them. Of course, this was not meant for me, but when there was no one around, I was the owner of the place, and no one ever found out. There were no cameras in the corner of the room. I was the camera, a living and moving one. I was the only one watching. Once I went to the bathroom, which was not meant for me. I was simply curious. I also had an urge, and since no one knew, I took the opportunity. When I entered the bathroom, on the contrary to the other rooms, there was a certain uniting power pulling and pushing it all together. There was suddenly no clash between the centuries, cultures, and lands. Instead of that, one could see a certain simplicity with a meticulous attention to detail. Suddenly there were no other things, and one vase in particular got my interest. It had an extremely simple form and was only decorated with 2 masks on the sides. Those masks were extending in snake-like forms, shaped like handles, fixed to the neck of the vase. Its colourful gradient going from light green to almost black made the bottom of the piece almost invisible, like if the masks and snakes were coming out of the air. Once I stopped in one of the rooms for a while, since there was a reflection of me in a strange mirror. I thought I would just check to see if everything looked fine. However, I could barely concentrate, since I was gazing at the snakes. 2 reptiles were supporting the glass, and I could not decide whether I was terrified or astonished. Those 2 creatures were tangled in each other, together supporting the mirror. Their tails were pushing each other closer to themselves, and their huge open mouths were almost eating the glass. Somehow, they were cooperating and fighting at the same time, both with the glass and each other, like all the pieces of furniture in the room. These weird connections and disorders were somehow present all over the house. There was surely some reason behind all this. Of course, in a way, all was serving its purpose. Chairs were meant to sit on, wardrobes were full of clothes, and so on. Yet, there was a certain thing between reason and instinct, tying and binding it all together. I remember this other book, also with an entangled snake on it. Once it was lying on one of these tables in the summer room. The book was decorated with a geometrical pattern consisting of interlacing strapwork of inlaid green Moroccan fabric. And in the centre of the cover, there was a snake, coiled and inlaid in snakeskin. Some people say there is a particular subtle psychology to each animal. Imagine, for example, a fight between a panther and a snake. Those two masses, completely different, clashing with each other. Another word for snake, serpent in French, means to creep. For some other people, it is a symbol of healing. And panther, a pan beast, also in French. So we have a creeping creature hiding in high grass versus the beast of all beasts. And when they fight, we can see each animal demonstrating their ability to its full scale. Of course, it depends on which kind of environment this fight takes place in, because the panther can take advantage of something the snake cannot. So in a way, it is beautiful to see these two beings in opposition, one completely different from the other. Now, imagine a panther holding a mirror. It is better to imagine its skin and body as a dark bronze sculpture of a warrior, manifesting all the powers and play of muscles, creating an intimidating pose. And I guess there is a reason why snakes change their skins, as we change our clothes in front of a mirror. It was like this for quite some time. The house grew from inside, almost bloating and swelling, as the collection was getting larger and larger. The house was getting full. Suddenly I had more things to watch over. I remember when the boy blowing bubbles came to join us. Some people call him Leon. That dark background with transparent soap bubbles. It always seemed to me like the bubbles would burst any time. And the house as well. They say that soap bubbles are extremely thin and that they only last for a few seconds. If soap bubbles are blown into air that is very cold, they will freeze when they touch a surface. The air inside will gradually diffuse out, causing the bubble to crumble under its own weight. If the air is even colder, the bubble will freeze in the air and will shatter when hitting the floor. It is very rare that when it hits the ground, it does not break. But if the bubble lands luckily and transforms into a frozen state, we may observe a very beautiful surface of a frozen bubble, which was meant to burst. But even after that, this frozen state does not last long. Eventually it will fall apart, and its pieces will transform into something else. It's hard to say what happened to Leon's bubble, but I can tell you what happened to a house. At one point, frozen, after the death, it was carefully documented and for some time just stayed in this frozen state. But according to the final wish, it was later disassembled and its frozen pieces were scattered all over the place. Finally it melted into a fluid liquid, to be frozen again into something new, somewhere else. It is hard to say what he would say. I can only tell you that he is still somewhere around, as I am. And after that, I have something more to look after. I remember the last painting which joined us. It depicts one particular street in Paris. Maybe it was a coincidence that this was the last picture to be with us. Some say it is the picture of the past, showing a city which no longer exists like this, because it has transformed into something else. Maybe that was something, which reminded him how it used to be when he came to the city for the first time. But others think that in a way it is the picture of the future, or at least some sort of plan for it. When I first came to the site, there was just nature with very few buildings around. On the plot, some carousels were spinning around, with occasional screams from some people who were just having too much fun. The place was already fine like that. And that was a great challenge. To preserve this at one point, to be careful not to freeze it, and at the same time to let it transform into something new. And of course, that was not my job, and I am sure you can be thankful that it was like that. I would be a horrible architect. As you might have seen this view of that street in Montmartre, some would say that the wall is dividing nature from the city. Or maybe the wall just goes through nature because nature is next to it, beneath it, and above it. I sometimes imagine how it would be to live inside that wall, that the wall does not divide anything, that it just leads through the wilderness, offering a shelter and nice views to the outside. So imagine a wall, straight and simple, but without its purpose, without nature or a city to tame. That would be a useless barrier, an unusable wall, but a beautiful frame, a nice refuge to stay in. See, I told you, I would have been a terrible architect. The melted liquid poured itself into a new pit hole, creating an artificial ground, embracing the trees and mixing with nature. Indeed, the bubble transformed into rectangular walls of glass, creating alluring inner courts unreachable as they are, frozen in a way, but moving, like those moving pictures nowadays. The walls, ceilings, staircases and niches of the house in Paris were disassembled and pieces scattered and reassembled by the land of origin. In a way, things went back as they used to be, before I came, or even before his time, and those thin lines, connections from the house, were stretched and prolonged. One could wonder what he would say, but I am sure, if you want, you can still see those thin lines, loose connections, just being somehow still present. At least I am aware of those. Now, one could speculate what is next. The future, of course, and the question is if all this was the right thing to do. Indeed, many snakes changed their skins, many people changed their clothes, and some mirrors are not showing the right reflections. And that maybe it will be like this in the time ahead of us. Maybe this is the future. I guess no one knows. And of course, there are still those frozen bubbles, shattered into myriads of pieces, some lying soaked in black gold, some bounded by red borders, some framing the wilderness, some letting it out, others telling a story of the past, present, and future, which is even nowadays worth hearing. Some people will surely nod that I would be a terrible architect, and others would add that my writing skills are horrible as well. I guess they may be right, since I am just a security guard looking after my secure garden. I guess we all will agree that we like the garden, and there always has to be some gardener for it, who looks after it. After all, it is just right to question all this because every garden has its back door. The snakes are everywhere. Some people are just bad gardeners, and wilderness and hesitation is not moving us forward. Surely there are people around already, knowing that not every snake is dangerous, and that there is a lot of beauty in those creatures, that there is something to the weird reflections of the mirror, that there are people who are fond of the garden, and they know how to treat it. I'm sure there is something in between the beauty of the snake, the reflection in the mirror, and the soap bubbles.